So, Tom, last week we started the conversation about the 6 precepts and the 4 virtues that we like to focus on in the Vino Veritas Society.
Precepts of the Declaration, virtues of citizenship. Right? Yep.
What makes somebody a good citizen, a virtuous citizen, and
Right.
and what they need to understand about America's founding to understand the American idea. And we got through.
So, Dave, you're saying it's more than just voting for big progressive programs. There's more to being a good citizen than just showing up to vote for progressivism.
That's more of the European idea? Is that the German idea? We can go all kinds of ways. The
Right.
Italian idea? No. So we started going down this path, right? We really got through 2 of the primary core precepts of the Declaration of Independence that we like to focus on here in the Vino Veritas Society in order to make our members more effective at talking about the Declaration, more effective at talking about the American idea, and helping them understand how to live better, more virtuous lives.
Right.
So we started with the idea of objective truth, right? We explained last week why there is such a thing as objective truth, why it's important to have a foundation that there is an objective truth in the world. And then we took that into, if there is an objective truth, one of those objective truths that the founders talked about. And I say truths because the founders said truths, and there are multiple truths. It's not just one.
We hold these truths, plural, to be self-evident, right?
So one of these objective truths is that all men are created equal.
Right.
And we emphasized and we talked a little bit about that means human beings. It's not men. The founders weren't just saying, well, all men are created equal, but women are not. It was all human beings are created equal. We know that from all of their writing through the time and several other documents, speeches, essays, books, letters, you name it. And then we started to get into individual natural rights. So if there is an objective truth, and that objective truth, or if there are objective truths,
right,
and one of those is that all men are created equal, if all men are created equal, that means all men have individual natural rights.
And I think before we slide into that 3rd precept, I think it's worth pointing out, first of all, that very first precept, that idea of objective truth, in a way, it's the most foundational. In a certain respect, it's the most fundamental, and it's the most highly contested today.
Right.
It turns out we live in a world where, certainly among the intellectual class, academicians, the PhDs, will reject the idea of some kind of objective truth. And even ordinary people, the way that they speak, the truth is they're kind of confused about it. If you present a moral principle or argument, they're very likely to dismiss it and say, well, that's just your opinion or that's just your feeling.
Sure.
They're unspoken premises. There's no right and wrong. There's just different views until they get upset about something. And the moment they get upset about something, by golly, that's wrong. Right? Well, Donald Trump is a bad man. That's not an opinion. That's not a feeling. That is an objective, concrete truth.
Right.
So the way most people operate is in this realm of sort of intellectual confusion. But our point here is this whole argument, the foundation of ideas that this nation rests upon are not feelings. They're not prejudices. They were presented as objective truths. And when we use that phrase, objective truth, I think it's important to point out we're talking about objective moral truths, objective political truths. You could probably get a lot of Americans today to agree that, well, there's some objectivity, maybe in the realm of mathematics or certain of the sciences. They might say there's some objectivity. But I also think
some. Let's emphasize some. We have actually seen articles in major publications, traditionally reliable, objective publications of the past, who now say math is racist.
Right.
So I want to emphasize the some.
Even that's become controversial, and I think a large swath of modern Americans. And probably people around the globe, I don't know this for sure, I'm just, this is sort of my hunch, would insist that there are no moral facts.
Okay.
There might be mathematical facts or scientific facts, but there are no moral facts. There are only moral prejudices or moral feelings, and certainly someone can
beliefs, as many would say.
Right, someone can certainly think that, but they'll never understand the argument of the Declaration of Independence. They'll never understand the American founding, because the whole premise is that there are objective moral facts, objective moral truths.
And you just said something really important that I don't know that enough people really appreciate. You say they'll never understand the purpose or the meaning of the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
I think we should have a conversation about why is that important? Why should people care about understanding the Declaration of Independence?
Well, first let me give an example, and it's not even a contemporary example. One of the best books written about the Declaration of Independence, it's a beautiful little book by a historian named Carl Becker. The title of the book is The Declaration of Independence, and the subtitle is A Study in the History of Ideas. And this book is written in the 1920s, long time ago. And Professor Becker did a beautiful job of, there's a whole chapter, he analyzes the Declaration as a work of poetry. So he compares it to famous works of poetry and the structure and the use of language and the rhythm. And then he does an analysis of the philosophic concepts in there and where they come from. And he's referencing John Locke and all that kind of stuff.
And to the poetry point, I think our listeners, our members should all realize many of the great constitutional historians, the great constitutional thinkers, those who've studied the Declaration, who've studied the Constitution, who've studied our founding, they study Shakespeare.
Right.
They study some of the great poetic writers in history because it helps them to better understand the documents themselves.
When I used to spend more time in the classroom, I would point out to students this is just one of many important differences between old laws, like at the time of the founding, and new laws, is that old laws tended to be enjoyable to read. Right?
That's really interesting.
You read through the Declaration of Independence. It is an enjoyable law to read. One of the very first actual statutory laws ever passed was the Northwest Ordinance. It is short. It's only a few pages long. And you read it, and there are, here, one passage that stands out in my mind. There's a passage in the Northwest Ordinance that says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary for a free society, schools and the means of education shall forever be promoted. That's a line from the Northwest Ordinance. And the point is, they were accessible, they were short, they were brief, and they were written in a pleasant, poetic way. Versus pickup. When I used to teach at Hillsdale College, and when I was there, Congress was repassing the higher education reauthorization. It's the whole body of federal law that governs universities and colleges and all that. And I was sitting there, my friend Larry Arnn, who's the president up there, and a number of us, and we all thought, we're smart guys. We're a bunch of PhDs in politics. We're going to see what's really inside this legislation. The thing was over 2,000 pages long.
Sure.
I couldn't get past page 3. I mean, it was the most mind-numbing. Every line was a reference to section this, subclause that, this. You had to try to piece all these things together. An ordinary person cannot just read it and make sense of it. And so, there is something to that poetic, the rhetorical qualities of those older documents.
And I think we've actually seen some of the same things from certain members of the Supreme Court, right? We see a contrast. I think there are some opinions from the Supreme Court that are dreadful to read.
Yes.
I have to go reference this and reference that, and there's no sense of understanding of the basics. And then there are things written by, say, Clarence Thomas that are beautiful.
In fact, I think the king of them all is recently departed Justice Antonin Scalia.
Sure.
Even his critics, his harshest progressive critics, acknowledge boy, he sure had fun when he had fun writing his opinions, and they're fun to read. That comes through.
And it didn't mean you had to agree with them.
Right.
But you
Right.
could still appreciate
Yes.
the investment he made into quality writing
Yes.
to make something meaningful, to show his fervor for the argument he was making.
Right. Wonderfully, he unlearned how to write like a lawyer. So you were asking the question of why should it matter that we understand the Declaration on its own terms, the way
Right.
that its authors and ratifiers understood. And it's important because of the true uniqueness of the United States. The United States is exceptional in a number of ways, but perhaps the most obvious, the most striking way is it's the first political regime, independent, sovereign political regime in all of human history to be based upon an abstract idea.
Right.
An idea that applies to all human beings, not just the people declaring independence, but to everybody, a moral truth applicable to everyone. That had, you think of the great civilizations of the Greek cities, Athens and Sparta, or you think of the Roman Empire, you think of all the other great empires throughout history. None had been founded upon an abstract idea. Since our regime is founded upon an idea, one of the first questions citizens should want to know is, well, are those ideas actually true?
Right.
Because if they're false, if they're a bunch of lies, well, by golly, we have been swindled, and we really need to rethink what the United States is. We certainly don't want to uphold the founding if it's a pack of lies and untruths. And that carries through in our history. I mean, really critical moments. Abraham Lincoln stood at the Gettysburg Cemetery in the midst of the Civil War. The war wasn't over, and it was terrible. It was the most dreadful, devastating, deadly thing in all of American history. And part of his purpose in the Gettysburg Address is to explain the cause. Why are we fighting this war? Why is he's president, he's commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy. Why is he leading this effort to fight this war? And he explains it right there in the beginning, 77 years ago. That's 1776, right? Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. There's that idea in the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln's trying to preserve it. He's trying to preserve the Union based upon that idea. If that idea is false, if that proposition is untrue, if it's a lie, then Lincoln was either a terrible fool,
right,
or he was a tyrant. Maybe, if he knew it was a lie and still fought a war to uphold it. And, the body counts are unbelievable in the Civil War. So for all these reasons, we want to know. There's also, cultural reasons today. Think of just how problematic the subject of race is. Race is a topic. It's a subject, it's a problem that to date has not gone away. And the question of racial injustice points directly to that core idea in the Declaration of Independence, right? Because the two seem to contradict each other. Racial injustice is wrong because all men are created equal and have the same natural rights. And so when we talk about racial injustice today, it's impossible to have that conversation without reference to our own founding ideas.
So are you saying, and I say this for anybody who doesn't realize this in jest or sarcastically, are you saying that the best way to deal with racial injustice in America today is to work towards the ideas of the Declaration rather than towards the ideas of central planning?
Absolutely. The ideas, the principles of the Declaration of Independence contain the solution to the whole problem of racial injustice and every other form of injustice.
So I want to point out two things, just to take a quick step back to some of the things you were saying. One, the argument about Lincoln. A little plug for you. The people who claim that Lincoln was a tyrant, there are people out there who say these ideas of that all men are created equal and that natural rights don't exist. They do call Lincoln a tyrant. And You wrote a little book over there.
I did.
Called Vindicating Lincoln that takes that idea on. So if anybody wants to get more into that, or go read it. I also want to touch on something that you were talking about, sort of this idea that all men are created equal, and it's a truth. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people today think that when we say that, it was just some American idea. It was we're going to create a law in America that says all men are created equal, right? Mm. They don't understand that it's a moral, objective, universal truth.
Right.
They just think of it as America was founded on this idea that all men are created equal, and we're just going to tell everybody that. There's no basis in that. There's no argument in that. It's just that's an American law that we're going to say we're going to base our entire society on something made up,
right,
so to speak. You were on the radio this week with Ross Kaminsky, mm-hmm. local here in Denver, mm-hmm. talking about the Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And you made a point when you were talking about the Fifth Amendment and the right to due process.
Right.
And that right is not just for citizens of America.
It says no person.
No person. And if we are going to
let me remind our listeners of that. In the Fifth Amendment, it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which means that applies to all persons
right.
here in the United States, not just citizens. I pointed out on the radio, John Quincy Adams, he was a lone wolf. Not many people agreed with him. I actually agree with his argument. He made the argument, he said, the moment the Fifth Amendment was ratified in 1791,
right,
from that moment on, slavery, legalized slavery within the states became unconstitutional. I think it's a really interesting, important constitutional argument, because when it says no persons, that applies to people who are legally designated as slaves. They're still persons.
Right.
It also means, visitors from foreign countries, someone traveling through the United States. We don't get to go arrest them and take their stuff and throw them in a dungeon just because they're not a citizen, right? That even they are afforded due process of law.
Right. So if all persons, we can't make a law, we can't create a foundational law that applies to everybody.
Right.
We can only create laws that apply to Americans, right? So if they are saying in the Declaration, or in this case in the Bill of Rights and the Fifth Amendment, that it applies to all persons, it's an acknowledgement that it is a universal objective truth.
Yes.
Rather than we're just creating some law that applies to American citizens. And if you're an American citizen, you must, because it's law, you must accept that all men are created equal. By talking about it in the form of, we don't care if you're a citizen or not.
Right.
You have a right to this. It's a moral, objective, inherent, universal law.
In fact, I'm going to offer an example, and it's going to be a kind of a goofy, geeky example, but it's about a subject that is not so politically charged. Sometimes I like to point out, I'll use as an example, the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher and scientist Pythagoras,
right,
who figured out what we call the Pythagorean theorem, right? And it's this relationship for right triangles between the two legs and the hypotenuse. And when you think, if I asked you the question, Dave, that Pythagorean theorem, is that a Greek idea? Does one need to be Greek? Does one need to speak Greek?
No.
Does one need to be part of the Greek culture in 300 BC when Pythagoras? Does one need to believe in the Greek gods? No, right? This is what we mean when we talk about objective truth. There is objective truth in the world waiting to be discovered.
Right.
And just because it hasn't been discovered yet doesn't mean it's not true. Just because some people have discovered it and others haven't doesn't mean it's there. It's true. It's waiting to be discovered. And once we discover it, we can share that truth with other people. I'm emphasizing the discovery of truth. And then through our actions, our statements, public documents like the Declaration of Independence, we can acknowledge that truth. We can recognize that truth. We're not creating the truth. We didn't make the truth.
Right.
We just discovered it, or we learned it from someone else, and we're sharing it with others.
And just because you discover the truth and you speak the truth doesn't mean that other people don't have to spend time learning in order to understand it. It doesn't make it any less true. It doesn't change that. But by reading the Pythagorean theorem in Greek, which presumably he wrote the explanation in Greek.
Sure.
I can't pick up that document and read it and understand it. It doesn't make it any less true.
That's right.
I have to go study other things. I have to first go study Greek in order to read and understand what he's saying. And then I have to study what a right angle means. And then I have to study what the legs are and what a hypotenuse is and what it is to square something.
Right.
And what it is to add something. And,
Right.
and all of these things, it doesn't make that one definition. And I think where people get hung up is our founders didn't write the Constitution and write the Declaration as if here's everything you need to know in order to understand this.
Correct.
They wrote it as here is the truth.
And I just want to reemphasize this. The founders did not make human beings equal by writing it in the Declaration. Human beings are equal by nature.
Right.
At least in their natural rights, which we're about to talk about. And the founders acknowledge that truth. This is not only the case with moral truths and political truths like human equality and natural rights. This is a case for all truths. The entire human population at one time believed universally that the earth is flat. And they had good reason to, because when you look around, well, it looks pretty flat, right? It goes off that way. It goes off. It's clearly flat.
I don't stumble to the side when I stand up.
Exactly. And when the very, very first scientists started thinking, we think it's a sphere. It's just a really big sphere, but it's a sphere. It's a globe. It's round. Opinions did not change like this. It took a long, long period of time, many decades, centuries in some cases, for people to start realizing, oh, it actually is a globe. It's not flat. When in the medical sciences, I was reading something not long ago when the whole germ theory of disease first came out. The idea that there are these microscopic germs that you can't see with the visible eye, but they're responsible. They get inside your body and do all kinds of havoc. It took decades for not just ordinary people, but the medical community, right, to come to accept this new truth. So this is the way it happens. Someone has an insight into the truth. They keep exploring it. They share it. They try to teach it to others. That's what we have in the Declaration of Independence. If you asked King George III at that time, on July 4th, 1776, hey, George, are all men created equal? Do all human beings have the same equal? He would said, of course not. We royals, we're clearly not the equal of the rabble, the peasants in the fields, right? He would have rejected it. He had his opinion. The American founders had theirs. They differed. But just because they differed does not mean there's no truth.
Right.
George was wrong. The founders were right.
Right. So if you have moral objective universal truths, one of those truths is that all men are created equal.
Yep.
All human beings are created equal.
They're all equally human.
Right. They're all equally human. In order to be equal, that means we all must have an equal right to our individual natural rights, our life, our freedom, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness, pursuit of property.
This is the third precept, this concept of natural rights, which again is a concept that is highly controversial today, largely either disputed or ignored. Certainly among the intellectual class, very, very few people, scholars, would say there are natural rights. And even many non-scholarly, ordinary Americans just kind of dismiss that as outdated, old, sort of quasi-religious language, from the American Revolutionary period. You mentioned my book on Lincoln, and I open that book. In the introduction, I present, and this is very revealing for the whole problem of progressivism and crony politicians. Clarence Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1991. That now seems like ancient history.
It really
it?
does.
I mean, that was That was almost 30 years ago.
Can we remind people who led that?
Well, and that's the point I was going to make. So when, at the time of his nomination, way back then in the 90s, they
almost 30 years ago,
the United States Senate had, like it has now, a Senate Judiciary Committee, which does most of the vetting, and they hold these public hearings. And the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 was a fellow named Joe Biden. And this is in 1991.
Right.
And he stood up. He was the chairman, so he's conducting the hearings. He welcomes Clarence Thomas and everyone who was in the room. And I'll never forget this opening statement. He said, I, Senator Biden, I have been on this committee for 17 years. I want our listeners to get their mind around it. In 1991, he had already been on that Senate Judiciary Committee for 17 years. And he said in all those years, he had never heard a lawyer or a judge talk about natural rights until Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas had written, he had published some essays, and he had given some talks, and he talks about natural rights. And the way Clarence Thomas came to this idea, Clarence Thomas was a student of Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
Clarence Thomas read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He read Lincoln's critique of slavery, and Lincoln's whole critique of slavery is based on the idea of natural rights, that slavery violates the natural rights of these black men and women and children. And Joe Biden, during those confirmation hearings, he said the most important job we have here is to try to figure out what you mean by these strange concepts of natural rights. Now, when he said that in 17 years he had, that committee, right, is the one that has hearings for all the judges who are appointed to federal district courts, appellate courts, hundreds. I actually believe Joe Biden when he said I've never heard a lawyer or judge talk about natural rights or the natural law. We need to know what you mean by these things. I think he was being honest. That's how disputed, discredited, dismissed this concept is. And yet it's central. It's critical.
Right.
We have rights that are not legal. They don't come from a law. They don't come from any bureaucrat. They don't come from any legislative body. We have them by our nature. Wherever we are, we could be stranded on a desert island. We could be engaged in a revolution and throw off. It doesn't matter what the status of a government is. We have a natural right to our own life, liberty, our private property, our pursuit of happiness. And when the founders talked about natural rights, what they meant was a rightful claim. So think of things, think of what you are by nature. You're a physical being. You have a metaphysical mind, a soul. There's something free inside you that can think and make choices, right?
Use reason.
You have an agency. You are morally responsible for, right? If your hand makes a fist and you punch someone, right? It's your mind. You are responsible for what your fist does.
Correct.
And that means you have a rightful claim to everything that is yours by nature. Your body is yours by nature. Your mind is yours. Your labor, if your mind instructs your hands to make something, or instructs your eyes to read something, and you learn something, you have some knowledge that you've gained in your mind, that's your property.
Right.
And you have a rightful claim to it. And if a law is passed that says we in the government, we're going to come take that from you, the law is wrong. The law is illegitimate because it's violating your natural rights. Natural rights are the standard by which we judge governments, by which we judge laws. Natural rights don't come from laws. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a standard by which to judge the law.
It's interesting. You bring up the natural law. And the juxtaposition of the natural law is the civil law, right? The civil code. We have our natural laws, and then the legislature makes civil law. Is that correct? Am I accurate in the way I'm describing that?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, it was an interesting act of branding in the 50s and 60s for a civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. had you branded that as the natural rights movement,
Right. Would have been a whole different conversation.
It would have been a whole different conversation.
That's right.
Because what they were asking was to create civil law to protect the rights of people whose natural rights were being abused.
Yes. And that's a key distinction, right? Your natural rights are natural. You have them inherent in you by birth. Whereas civil rights are created by civil laws, by civil government, within civil society.
So I just sit here and I wonder, where have freedom people, remember I like that term. Where have freedom people been? How do we allow things like a civil rights movement rather than a natural rights movement?
It's a great point. I've never really thought about it in that term, in that juxtaposition, but it's perfect. What should have happened? We should have had a natural rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s, not a civil rights movement. Here's another.
Before we get off of that, I'm going to theorize something.
Yeah,
that's also the reason that despite the changes that have happened over the last 60 years, nothing's really changed. I mean, sure, we've desegregated schools.
Right.
We don't have, there's no more separate but equal. There's no more separation on buses and things like that. But
I would say things have changed in this way. We're also much less free.
Sure.
We're more regulated. We're more licensed. We're more controlled than ever before, because that whole framework of civil rights was really an excuse for government to start exercising control, right? So in the name of civil rights, for some, government says, I'm not going to tell you how you're going to run your business.
Sure. And the fact that we're still fighting about racial injustice, and I think there's a core misunderstanding in society today that most people don't think, most on the left don't believe that those on the right, the conservatives, they don't think that there's racial injustice out there, right? I think a lot of people on the left think people like you and I, freedom people, don't actually think that there's racial injustice. To me, that's not true. I think there's quite a bit of racial injustice.
Or either that, or they think that freedom people know about racial injustice and don't care. And just don't care.
Sure.
I heard this is within the last week, a young college and graduate school educated woman say to me that the only reason anyone could possibly object to Obamacare is because they don't like the skin color of Barack Obama.
And I've been accused of that too.
I offered this critique of why it's bad for government to take over businesses and property that's not theirs. And she said, that is the first time I have ever heard an objection that's not a personal racist attack on Barack Obama.
So that tells me something. That tells me that we as the Vino Veritas Society, that we as patriotic Americans, even if you're not a part of the Vino Veritas Society, or just we as freedom people in general, need to do a better job of learning how to talk about these things and engaging in conversations like that. Because if she's never heard that before, that means there's never been anybody who's either able or willing to stand up and talk about that.
Right.
So to wrap a bow around the conversation about civil versus natural.
I actually want to add a ribbon.
Please.
I want to add a loop, because so if you have this concept of natural rights, these are your natural liberties. Your natural rights are whatever is rightfully yours by nature. So it's everything yours. It means you cannot have a natural right to someone else's property. It's why there is no natural right to education. There's no natural right to health care. There's no natural right to housing, because all those kinds of economic rights require taking something from somebody else. Somebody else either has to build a house for you or pay for a house for you to have, say, a right to housing. What you have a natural right to is whatever's yours, your freedom of mind, your body, your labor. On one side of that is the idea of civil rights. These are rights that actually get created by government. The right to a trial by jury. That's a civil right, because trials and juries don't exist in nature.
Correct.
Right? Government has to create this structure. Here's the courthouse. here's how we're going to form a jury, here's how we're going to run a trial. All that has to be spelled out by law, created by law. On the other side of natural rights would be the idea of divine rights, divine law. And that too is different than a natural right, because divine rights or divine laws, actually the better term, requires a sectarian faith in a particular religion and even more specific, particular revelations from God, where God allegedly, right, provides certain laws to human beings. That's divine law. Divine law requires sectarian religious faith. But remember, these truths we're talking about truth, self-evident, objective truths.
And remember, for everybody listening, if you haven't watched the American Idea Toolbox yet, self-evident does not mean observable.
Right.
It means discoverable. It means defined within its own explanation.
The evidence is contained within the terms of the proposition. That these are rational truths, that any reasoning mind, just like any reasoning mind, can figure out the Pythagorean theorem. Whether they read Pythagoras or not, spend enough time studying right triangles, and you might figure out the Pythagorean theorem all on your own.
Right.
So too, a rational mind thinking about human things can discover this concept of natural rights with sheer unassisted reason. In that sense, natural rights is not a product of civil law, nor is it a product of divine law. It is a natural phenomenon that the human mind can discover through reason. This is important because it'll provide the foundation of religious liberty, saying we can have people here with different religious views, different kinds of religious faiths, and as long as they agree that we all have the same natural rights and that law should protect our natural rights, then one person can go to his church and the other person can go to his synagogue, and the other guy can stay home because he's kind of an atheist, right? And there's no necessary civil conflict as long as the laws are protecting natural rights and not based on some kind of religious divine revelation.
Right. So I had the thought. I like thought experiments. I like thinking through what ifs, and I always get into those types of TV shows of what if this had happened, right? Things like Man in the High Castle that theorizes what would have happened if the Allies had lost World War II and Germany and Japan split America into along the Rockies and took over. And I get into those types of things. I sit back and I wonder, and I don't want to take anything away from Martin Luther King Jr. The guy did. There's some things he did that I really love. There's some things he believed in that I disagree with.
Right.
But I don't want to take anything away from him. But I wonder, where would we be today if you supplanted Frederick Douglass for Martin Luther King Jr. In the 1950s and 60s?
I agree.
And what would that have been like? Frederick Douglass was a brilliant speaker. Was extremely knowledgeable. Was well read. This is somebody who had this ability to have the same social impact, the same emotional impact on people.
In fact, let me just boost Frederick Douglass up a little more. I mean, not that he needs my help, but just for the listeners to have some sort of context here. Frederick Douglass is one of my teachers. I consider Frederick Douglass a teacher about the United States Constitution, and I have spent most of my adult life trying to understand the Constitution. And I read not only the founders, not only Madison and Hamilton and the others, but Frederick Douglass. One of the most important things I learned from him, he greatly emphasized the importance that the words slave and slavery were nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. And he, Frederick Douglass, a former slave, said that is huge. It's huge. It told him this was a constitution designed for a future where slavery would be gone, because they didn't want to contaminate that constitution by recognizing the institution by name, because they were all expecting this institution is going to go away within a decade or two, a generation. They didn't know exactly when, but it's on its way out.
Well, he recognized the poison pills that were set up along the way. whether
That's
it was a 3/5 clause or
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah.
The founders set up all the poison pills
Yeah.
that said within this amount of time, we're going to have everything in place for somebody like Lincoln to come along
Yeah.
and put an end to this.
And so I don't just look at Frederick Douglass as some figure from the past to talk about. I look to him for enlightenment,
Sure.
for education and inspiration. I would add in your thought experiment is quite fascinating. Also a Booker T. Washington, lesser known than Frederick Douglass, but either of them. But both of them were tremendous students of the founding. Both of them studied the philosophic concepts of the Declaration of Independence and agreed. And they said, that's right. Those ideas, that's the key to freedom. That's the key to justice. We, in the later times, what we need to do is rearrange our lives and rearrange our policies to align with those ideas.
Right.
Not badmouth the ideas, not reject the ideas.
Right. So I think we've established the third step in the sequence of the Declaration, right? That there is a moral objective truth, that one of those moral objective truths is that all men are created equal. And if all men are created equal, that means that all men have a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we've established that, but we haven't totally clarified what that actually means.
Right. And we also need to address the most frequently voiced critiques or challenges to that. After all, the people saying all men are created equal included slave owners. So some of the founders had slaves. Therefore, that concept in the Declaration must be false. It's a lie. Well, there are several important things to say in response to that. First is, you, the progressive, you've just forfeited. You've just given up your own natural rights because you're so eager to bash the founders.
Right.
They said everyone has equal natural rights, which includes you, Mr. Progressive, sitting here.
Or Ms. Progressive.
Or Ms. Progressive, right? You, the progressive, sitting in 2020. The founder said, you have the same natural rights to your life, your liberty, your property as everyone else. You've just abandoned that. You've just said you have no natural rights in order to bash the founders, which is an unwise thing to do. More to sort of cutting to the core of all this. Those black men, women, children who were held as slaves and that practice of holding them by force was backed up by laws, typically state laws that recognize them as property. Here's what's shocking to many people to learn this. They too had the exact same natural rights as every other human being.
Right.
For the simple reason it is an objective moral truth that they too are human beings. They too have a right to their own person, their own liberty, the right to govern themselves, so that the laws protecting slavery, those laws were wrong. The slave owners who were using force to hold slaves hostage, basically they were kidnapped human beings. Those slave owners were wrong. And it's why the entire institution is wrong. That insight that these slaves have the same natural rights as everyone else, and that's a relatively new insight. Remember, slavery is thousands of years old, and throughout most of human history, very few people thought slaves have the same rights as legally free men and women. The Americans did.
Right.
And it sparked, it fueled, it ignited the greatest anti-slavery movement in all of history because they realized they too have the same rights. One of the curious phrases about natural rights, in the Declaration of Independence, they are described as unalienable rights, meaning they cannot be taken away. That really distinguishes natural rights from a civil right, because if a civil right is created by a law,
the law could take it away.
Right, you could pass another law repealing the first law, take that right away. But these natural rights, the founders said, are unalienable. You can't, even if you try. And very often progressive critics will say, well, what about those slaves when they're being beaten and they're tied up with chains and they're not free to leave and their property's taken from them, they don't have rights. And I like to ask a question in response. Well, if they don't have rights to their own life or to their own property, why is it wrong to enslave them?
Right.
And that very often, if the progressive is capable of thinking, they'll pause because they see the conundrum. They want to say that slavery is wrong, as they should. I agree it's wrong. But they've just said the slave has no right to his liberty, that the slave has no right to his property. Well, then what makes it wrong? It's the existence of his natural rights, the slave's natural rights, unalienable rights. To be clear, those rights are being violated. Oh, they're being grossly violated. But it's not like the slave doesn't have those rights.
Right.
Yeah, he has rights, and justice then requires that we should get rid of slavery. The slave owner should stop enslaving the slave.
Let's bring that back full circle to the earth is flat conversation, right? Mm-hmm. The person who owns a slave is the same as the person who says the earth is flat. Mm-hmm. They have not yet accepted that there is a truth that they don't have a right to own another human being.
That's right.
And like you said, sometimes that takes a long time to make universally accepted, to the point that today there are still flat earthers. There are still people on this planet, in this country, that make the argument, no matter how educated they are, that the earth is flat. And all of the everything they've been told and everything they've seen, they don't care. They think it's all a scheme, a hoax.
Yeah.
And the earth is flat.
It is one of the strangest intellectual phenomena when the progressive critique to say, well, some of the founders were enslaving others. Therefore, they conclude, the progressive concludes, all those ideas in the Declaration are lies. It's as if, suppose I were to steal your wallet or steal some of your property, would that prove that you have no right to your property? Well, no, it wouldn't. You still have your property rights. And in fact, that makes it wrong. That's what makes it wrong for me to steal your property. Or here, let's make it even worse. What if I stole your property and then wrote an essay saying all human beings have a right to their own property? I stole, and I said all human beings have a right to their own property. Would my stealing negate the idea of property rights? No. It just means I violated the very standard I'm articulating. My essay saying every human being has a right to property is correct, and my stealing your wallet would be wrong because that's correct.
It would also probably get you elected to office in California.
That's right. Or maybe even higher offices.
Offices.
I might be able to land myself in the White House.
And what's so fascinating is we're now seeing there's a law going through. I don't know if it's the city council in Seattle or the state government in Washington that is now saying it's okay to steal from someone else if you need that more than them in order to survive.
There you go.
And you will not be prosecuted. That is not constitutional. There is no circumstance where that can be acceptable.
Well, there is a circumstance where it can be acceptable to progressives because it really is, it's the logical extension of the morals of progressivism.
Sure.
That's what progressive policies do, is they take from people they think can afford it, and then they turn around and give to those they think need it. Whether they're accurate doesn't really matter. So it's kind of an extension of progressivism. And that leads us really into the next topic, which we're going to have to pick up next time because we're out of time here today.
Well, let's take 5 more minutes before we end this, and let's close by actually defining life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Okay.
Because I don't think we've done that yet, and I think we can't leave this topic open.
Okay.
Without actually defining those.
Okay.
So why don't you start and I'll jump in.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which, so this is not an exhaustive list. This isn't all. These are just 3 among others. Among these natural unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, by nature, you're a living being. You're not a rock or a stone or some inanimate, right, element. You have all the materials and parts to be a metabolizing living being, which is why it's right for you. By your nature, it's right, it's fitting, it's proper for you to be alive.
Sure.
Another way to say that is you have a right to your life. Certainly, I or any other human being, no other human being has a right to come and take your life. The fact that you're alive, that's yours by nature. Nobody else. You have a natural, unalienable right to your life, and you have a very peculiar kind of life. There are many other living beings, all the animals in the animal kingdom, and yet, distinct from all of them, you have this metaphysical freedom. You have this rational mind capable of reasoning, thinking, making choices. And that is the source of liberty. You're not just a living creature. You're a living creature with liberty. You can govern yourself by making your own choices. So by nature, it is right, it is fitting, it's proper for you to be alive and to be free.
Which also means you're capable of not violating other people's natural rights.
That's right.
And it's a big difference when people say, you hear all the time growing up, it's like one of the middle schoolers' favorite comment, it's a free country. I can do whatever I want. It's a free country. No, freedom, liberty, the natural right to liberty means you have a natural right to make choices
for yourself.
So long as they don't violate the natural rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
There's a moral parameter
Correct.
within which you have to stay. A phrase that the founders like to use was they would contrast liberty and licentiousness. Liberty is not license. You don't have permission. Your liberty is not permission to go out and steal from others or go out and hurt others. Liberty is the right to govern yourself, to make your own choices about how you're going to live. And what do free beings do? And here I'm reminded both Aristotle's, his book on the Politics, that was the title, The Politics, and his book on ethics. They both begin exactly the same way. And that is to say, every human choice, every human action points at a goal, at a target, at an end. And the highest end, when you add up all the choices we make, the highest goal is happiness. And then he demonstrates this. Every choice you make, some of the choices we make are big, important choices, what to major in college, what career to have, who to marry. Those are big life-altering choices. Some are much more mundane, right? What am I going to eat for dinner? And what outfit am I going to wear today? I like to wear black, so it just keeps it simple. When you look at choices, I'll lay out just a typical example people can relate to. You set your alarm in the morning. Why? You don't do it for the sake of hearing the alarm. You do it because you want to get up in time. The alarm helps you get up. So you choose to set the alarm for a goal that's higher than the alarm. Well, why do you want to get up on time? Because you want to get to work on time. That goal is higher.
Right.
Why do you want to get to work on time? Is that useful for something higher? Yes, it is. You want to make your boss happy. Right. Show him that you show. Is that the highest goal, to make your boss happy? No, you want to make your boss happy so that you can get promotions and pay raises, right? You keep going up that ladder. And Aristotle asked this question: is there ever a goal that is chosen for its own sake and never for the sake of something else? And he said there's one. There is one goal that we seek that is never just useful for something else. It's its own end. Happiness. We never choose happiness because that's useful for something else. Everything else we're choosing are steps on the path we hope will result in happiness. Free beings pursue happiness. And sometimes we do it wisely and sometimes we do it foolishly, right? We make stupid choices we think will make us happy. and we didn't think about it very well, and we end up miserable. Lots of people do this, but we're still trying to be happy.
Right.
Even when we make mistakes, we're still trying to be happy. And so I'll just summarize here. So that's why you have an unalienable natural right to your life, to your liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness.
Right.
Because that's what free beings strive for.
And that's what basic reason comes down to. When you make a reasoned decision, you're deciding, is my instinct, following my instinct, going to make me happy without violating somebody else's natural rights?
Yep.
Or is limiting my instinct and acting in another way going to make me happier? And that's the foundation of what makes us human.
And it doesn't even always have to involve other people. Think of the addict, someone addicted to alcohol or drugs or something like that, right? They're sitting there and they're looking at that substance, and within them there's a conflict. Their reason is saying, man, those drugs are ruining your life. You just lost your last 3 jobs because of that drug. You shouldn't do it anymore. And their appetite is saying, I love the sensation of being high from that, right? And there's a contest within them. And sometimes their reason wins, and very often it doesn't. But this is what reasoning creatures do with their liberties. They try to achieve happiness, which is why the Declaration recognizes. It doesn't invent that right, it doesn't create it. It's just acknowledging free human beings have a natural, rightful claim to their life, their liberty, their pursuit of happiness. And look, we can't be happy. It is impossible to be happy without property. It's impossible because we need shelter, we need food, we need medicine, we need to be able to keep the fruits of our own labor. Those are all forms of property. So when Jefferson writes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, property is assumed to be within the pursuit of happiness, that we can keep what is rightfully ours.
Right. Which is also why you could say he used the words among them.
Among, that's right.
Rather than which are.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
With that, we'll get into the last couple next week.
Yeah, because this kind of raises the whole question that why do we need government? What's government supposed to do? And that's going to be our next topic. Our next precept is what is the proper purpose of government.
Right. Until then, nos somos custodes.
Absolutely.